Well, hello, I'm Luther Kruger with the Big Blue Sun Museum of Solar Cooking, based in Minneapolis. And I'm here in beautiful, rainy Seattle, talking to Tom Sponheim and Paul Hedrick, who run this SCI Wiki for everyone to learn about solar cooking. And I'll just have a few questions, and we'll talk about a little bit about their history. And we'll take it from there. We'll start with Paul, brief introduction, and then we'll turn it over to Tom. How did you get started in solar cooking?
Well, it was Tom's influence. I began working with Tom, I believe, in about 2009. And actually, I have a son, Benjamin, who initially was helping Tom do some early editing on the wiki. And he took off to college, and I stepped in and began helping myself. And then formally joined SCI in 2010 and have sort of been building my knowledge base since from that. My background, I'm also an architect, and so I'm always interested in product design and have actually played with some of my own designs for box cookers and panel cookers, so I was definitely intrigued with the technology, and that's been pretty much it. And so Tom was really the inspiration and the genesis of his early website that he'll tell you about.
Sure. So, Tom, what was the first time you ever heard about solar cooking?
During the Ethiopian famine in the early 80s, I believe it was, I saw a video of a woman in Ethiopia taking a cow dung patty and laying it out to dry so that they could burn it. And at that point, I had bought the Halsey book. When I was in the 70s, I bought the Halsey book and carried it around for all this time, and had never built a cooker because I thought you needed to use plywood and insulation and double pane glass and caulking and all that stuff. I never got around to doing it. So I moved from sunny Southern California to Seattle, and on a pre-internet network called EcoNet, I read something about Solar Cookers International. And I read that you could build a solar cooker from cardboard and a piece of glass at the time, and aluminum foil. So I immediately built myself a cooker. It was an early spring, and I remember sitting there for like a week looking out the window, trying to wait for some sun. And so I then started cooking, and was so impressed at how it was kind of like falling off a log, easy to cook. Like everything just cooked easily. So it was a box cooker made of, a larger box with a smaller box with some insulation in the walls, and then a lid with a single back panel, and glass at the time I was using, single pane. And we took it down to Green Lake and showed people, and people were kind of excited. And I remember one woman walked up to me and she said, "There'll be cultural barriers to this." And I thought, "Oh, you're going to rain on my parade," but I don't believe you anyway. Anyway, I've learned since then. So what happened was somebody mentioned, "Why don't you call the Seattle Times and get the science reporter to come out?" And so it was a different deck, but right here is where he came out and interviewed me and took photos, and I was like the front page of the B section or something. It was a whole page with a giant picture of me and everything. So a lot of people wrote to me from around Seattle. And during that time, I was doing little things to help out SCI, mostly just with word processing, since I was into computers then and they really weren't. So I was making them forms and things. And so once the group of people who wrote me, I contacted them all, and we created our own group called Solar Box Cookers Northwest. And we did probably 5 or 6 trainings, and we published a newsletter called Solar Box Journal. And eventually, we felt like there was not enough follow-through from the people that we trained. We don't exactly know how many people continue to solar cook, but so we decided to to merge our activities with Solar Cookers International. So I passed over the Solar Box Journal, and that became their Solar Cooker Review. And then I also passed over during that time I was working at Microsoft, and I created the Solar Cooking Archive, which was a website in the mid-90s. And so when I went for an interview as a temp at Microsoft, I was able to show them this website that I created as nonprofit volunteer activities, and that helped me get into Microsoft. So those of you that are sitting around wondering how you were ever going to get anywhere in this society, I would really recommend volunteering. So then I kept up with the Solar Cooking Archive, and the reason it was named that was so that people would see that it's a place to go for historical and current information. Some people thought it possibly meant it was only old information, but eventually when I went to the conference in Granada, Spain, and met just about everybody in the solar cooking movement in person. I mean, of course, there's many people, hundreds and hundreds in India that never made it there, I'm sure. But I came back, and this Wiki thing, Wikipedia had come out, and I thought, boy, it would be so great if everybody could just participate in the same information base without having to send things to me and wait for me to put them up there. So I created a Wiki version of the site, and little by little, I put links from the archive. Instead of to an individual page on the Solar Cooking Archive, I put them to the Wiki page. And so they were side by side for a while, but pretty soon almost all of the links from the Solar Cooking Archive, just plain old HTML site, were pointing to the Wiki anyway. So there was a point where we decommissioned the Solar Cooking Archive and then completely made the URL solarcooking.org redirect to the Wiki and not be the main page of the Solar Cooking Archive. So just so everybody knows, these days you can type in solarcooking.org, and that'll take you to solarcooking.fandom.com/this wiki/whatever. Sure. Anytime you want to link, tell somebody a link, just tell them, go to solarcooking.org/cookit. Go to solarcooking.org/Portugal. And a little trick I'll tell you, if you want to send somebody a link to the Portuguese version of the site, say go to solarcooking.org/PT, which is the code for, if you want to send to the French version, solarcooking.org/FR. It's got about 37 languages you can do that, maybe 45 languages. And also, once you send them to the main page that way, when they click a link on that page, it'll automatically translate the next page, so they can just go through the entire wiki in any language you want.
Basically, the wiki, it reminds me of the library at Alexandria, which supposedly had...
It didn't have a good end.
It didn't have a good end. Well, I mean, but it supposedly had every item.
That's our goal, yes.
Yeah, where it had every book from everywhere, Mesopotamia, from China, from wherever, all over the world. And of course it ended in flames, but we hope this will carry on, and if the technology improves, it'll even be more accessible, even though it's really easy to use now. But the one big question I have, as I've talked to cooker makers, as I've networked with people like in Portugal, talking to those that are really implementing it around the world, is what are the best practices for getting people to adopt it as a long-term solution for them?
That's a big question. Speaking back about the woman at Green Lake that said there'll be cultural variables. Yep. There have been, we were just discussing in our break here about, there are problems with, cooking. A lot of people cook inside. I'm talking about third world countries here, developing countries. There are reasons for that, like they don't want other neighbors to know that they have food, which things that we here in developed countries so far wouldn't even have thought of. There's also the problems about when you can cook. If you can cook can you cook breakfast? Probably not. lot of times the men are away for lunch working, so there can be problems in that way as far as having hot food. But as far as the best practices go, from what we've seen, definitely use is the highest and lasts the longest for people in the most desperate situations, like refugee camps, places where they're basically not exactly locked in, but if you think about a camp in the middle, like of the Chadian desert, where the UN is coming and putting a camp, and it's in an area where other people live outside the camp, and there's a limited supply of firewood. There's a lot of animosity by the local population if all of the refugees are coming out of the camp to collect the last bit of firewood, so they're attacked. And so the people that are, stories I've heard that inside the camps, people are given such a very small amount of firewood that they really don't have enough to cook every day. And also, people bring in, like donkey wagon loads of firewood or charcoal, and people will trade some of the money that they would use for food, or maybe trade the actual food given to them by the UN for cooking fuel. So in situations like that, it seems like it's been very successful, at least for periods of time. Now, the types of cookers that have been used mostly have been cardboard cook-it-style cookers in the largest projects, which have a certain lifetime. And Chad is not exactly a real hospitable environment. Basically, you have to have an army escort, to take you in and out, and the materials aren't available anywhere near there. So I think the pages on the Wiki, we've got probably about pages for 8 refugee camps or so. And the most important thing is to continue the support of the people. So if you introduce something new like solar cooking, don't expect that it's going to be obvious to them how they're going to be able to cook all the different foods that they cook, and how they might handle keeping the food hot after they've cooked it, and how they might handle, like, if you're the only one in your village, or the only one on your block or in your neighborhood that's cooking, that might be some stigma. There might be some stigma there for you that we wouldn't know about.
Sure.
So by having the continued support and training and visits to each person, where you can ask, what are your problems that you're having, and how can we help you with that? Because there often are very simple ways to alleviate some of the problems that they say they're having. So far, I would say it's kind of like George Bush, 1,000 points of light.
Right.
There's 1,000 points of light out there. There have been some very successful projects in Latin America by Bolivia Inti Sud Soleil, and the refugee camp projects have been successful for a time. And then there's thousands of places around the world where small numbers of people solar cooking. But I haven't seen it yet take off, like cell phones or thermoses in Nepal, for example. I know that the cell phones take off because it's the idea, like the Gillette razor blade thing, where they sell you the razor for almost nothing, and they know they're going to get money from you for the blades. The way I understand it is cell phones, they can get them for very cheaply when they buy minutes over time. So a poor person has been able to have something that's way more expensive than they could afford, but they basically have it, and they buy their minutes as they can. So we haven't seen that kind of a wildfire type takeoff, which is what I kind of in the beginning figured would happen, because I just watched how simple it was to solar cook, and I saw what need there was around the world.
Well, I had visited Solar Urban Partners in South Dakota at just a farm town where a farmer had actually bought in kind of an abandoned building where they assembled the pallets of everything they shipped to. And the big challenge was sending someone there to do training. And their protocol is you come and get a cooker, but you got to go through 2 days of training before you get the cooker. You'll see how it's assembled. You'll see how it works. You'll know,
Fits in with what I was
yeah,
saying about
exactly. And they're about to do a study. We're about to do a study. This is a couple months ago on the adoption rate, because they figured with that kind of training and people committing to 2 whole days, or they're going through this, that they figured the adoption rate should be pretty high. The adoption and retention, where they're actually doing it more.
And it seems like that would be a model, but that's very labor intensive. A lot of volunteers that they have to get out there to Haiti. The cooker is made from fluteboard. It's kind of like the sun stove, only fluteboard and then stamped spectral aluminum on the inside with insulation.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent the day helping them put together the pallets just to learn what they're all about. Are there other organizations that do something like that right now? Inti
Soleil?
Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly how they go about their work, so
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't tell you exactly. We have an article, it's probably a little bit dated, but a fairly extensive article on the Wiki on them.
I remember seeing a video that I think they put this together where they had a solar cooking contest to see who could cook certain dishes.
Okay.
And they went, and it wasn't just like 5 or 10 in a park. It was like this plaza with, it must have been 30 or 40 or 50 cookers,
Mm-hmm.
and they had a judge, and and it seemed like that would be, that way, like Sarah said in Portugal, we have to make solar cooking cool. We have to make it look like, wow, that is the coolest thing to do,
Right.
And it seemed like they had that angle down very well.
Yeah, we should probably be learning more from them.
Yeah. Well, and I think I mentioned in my email that the end of my trip will be doubling back to Yakas, Oregon, to pick up the Villager. And what we'll be doing is using that at open streets things. I'm sure they have them here in Seattle, other big cities where they basically block off like 10 blocks in a row. In Minneapolis, it's 20 or 30 blocks from Lake Street to like 46, which is like 26 blocks.
Oh.
And every intersection they go through east-west, but they block it off north-south. And everyone and their uncle, you can reserve space. I think you pay a small fee for if you're going to have like a food truck or something.
Right.
And so I'm going to find out what that's all about, find my space.
Idea.
And Nicollet, which is a real busy thoroughfare in Minneapolis, I'm a half a block from there on 35th.
Yeah.
And so if I can get something within a block or two of that, I could probably wheel the Villager there myself. But
I would also suggest having some simple designs like the windshield shade cooker,
Yes.
things like that people could actually just see it and go, wow, we could do that.
Yep.
I mean, there's a fine line between making something that's kind of a little pitiful but simple to use and giving people a chance and showing them something that they could never obtain. That's why I went in the direction myself of the cardboard type things, and then you run into the problems that I described before. But if you're in the first world, I hate to use, you're not supposed to use those words, but in developed country where you have your own stove indoors, I'm still a big fan of a simple solar cooker that you can use outside in the summer, because like some of these bigger, heavier cookers that you can switch between electricity and the sun.
Yep.
Seems to me a bit much because you could always go inside and cook with electricity or gas, whatever you have. But if you want to, the reason to use a solar cooker in a developed country is because it keeps your house cool just in the summer. It's actually unattended cooking. As long as you're using like a panel cooker or a box cooker, you can just put the things out, put the food in the cooker, face it a little bit ahead of the sun, and then let the sun go by for 2 or 3 hours, and it cooks. And so it's actually simpler. It helps your life. And then if the weather's bad or it's a day you can't cook, you just cook normally. But buying a big parabolic cooker is something that you have to store and carry around, and that you have to actually stand out there and attend to food. In our society right now, it seems a little bit much.
Yeah, I was won over to panel cookers. I had a real prejudice against them way back when. But then I got the hot pot and put out.
Excellent.
Yeah, I put a beef stew out there like 9 in the morning, pointed it toward about 1 or 2 in the afternoon, basically, and left it there. 5 o'clock, bring it in, and the meat was like, it was almost like Jello. I mean, it was so tender.
You can overcook meat.
Oh yeah, but I mean, it was wonderful, and so I'm okay now. I get it. This get cooked just as well as anything else.
maybe it's a little more time, but just set it and forget it. Like the
Right,
old deal ad.
as long as you take into account the unattended cooking factor, then it's got pluses for people who already have a way to cook. Also, I'm working on a project in Nairobi where people are living in the slums, where they rent, like there's these big long buildings made from corrugated metal, and there's divided into little rooms, and you rent your room for $10 or $20 a month. And there's really no place to put a cooker, and things would be stolen if they were left outside. So a panel cooker there that folds up is really the only thing that's going to work. And now that the weather is changing, and it's been a really bad rainy season this year. Now that it's changing, we're going to be doing panel cookers. The Haynes solar cooker is what we're going to start with.
That's another one where I visited Roger 2 years ago. I'm going to be visiting him and Sharon Clausen in San Diego and doing a little spiel with them. And I remember setting that out with just about a cup and a half of beans and 4 cups of water, and about 45 minutes later that low simmer, and it just stayed that way the whole day. I mean, it was a thing of beauty to see something like that. But that's the plan with the open streets, and with there's a farmer's market about 6 blocks from my house where I would set out panel cooker, box cooker. The farmer's market, they probably wouldn't have enough space for me to park the Villager, but I'll have the simplicity for the Parabolic.
It would be a crowd drawer.
People, yeah.
The Villager especially would be bring them in from a distance.
Yeah. Well, where that'll be big is we have a community school, Lindale neighborhood. They have Lindale School, and they have a community garden. And there's 2 or 3 parents that basically manage the whole thing, and they grow. It's take this deck times about 4, and that's the size of it. I mean, it's really not that huge, but they produce like nobody's business.
Yeah.
And so I've already told them if I ever pick up a Villager, whenever you have a date where it's sunny and you're doing weeding or planting, whatever, park it there. Tell people to bring their bread dough, and then do your work, and I'll be there to watch the bread.
Right.
So, but like for the farmers markets, I'll have at least the 3 major ones, and I do have the Go Sun Fusion to show the little solar panel thing, and then that feeds the heating element in the trop. But no, you're right. Having the variety out there and showing, well, this is the power of the sun, just the window.
I think it's time for all of us in the solar cooking movement to not have prejudices against various types, because as we talked just in the last 5 minutes about this one type is great for here, another type is great. There are other places where a parabolic cooker could allow people to be cooking for a shorter time outside, and they have space for it, and they don't have to make something sit out there for 3 or 4 hours. That could be a plus. And they can also cook stir fry, and they can do a lot of things that our panel and box cookers can't do. So I really think it's important for us all to just open our minds. And Paul was speaking on a break here about cookers powered by photovoltaic panels. Sure. And we know that all of the villages in Africa and Latin America, they're not going to be putting electric cables and telephone poles all the way to all these villages. It's going to be solar. It's going to be the power. So there's some people used to think you needed to use resistance cooking, where you're using the resistance of the electricity to make the heat, but there's heat diodes now, and there's induction cooking. I don't claim to understand it all, but there are, Pete Schwartz is working on this induction cooking, I think, or I know they're doing heat diodes. And so if you had a solar powered, this little house like I was just talking about in Kenya, and it was suddenly powered by solar, and you could have a small cooker that used that electricity to cook, and you could cook at any time, and you wouldn't have to worry about a lot of the things I said that are the barriers to solar cooking. So that's something. Solar photovoltaic cells are getting cheaper and cheaper, and the technology is being investigated, and we're learning more. So that might be the final breakthrough. I'm still a big fan of wall ovens.
Yes.
Like solar thermal wall ovens, where it's built into the house and you can just open a door like you're opening the microwave and set the food in. I really do think if that, like when the houses were built, if those were built in, that would be accepted very easily.
From my architectural background, I have to throw in that I'm pretty skeptical of some of these wall ovens and contraptions that have been put on the exterior of the house. People don't realize how heavily things get weathered, and they can't really take the weather from the outside. And so I thought about having an extended wall oven myself. and taking advantage of the latest technologies of heat mirror glazing and double glazing that can actually be reversed. And so instead of reflecting the heat away, having the heat go in but have it being reflected back at the food. A little bit on a sidetrack, it was several years ago, a solar pioneer, Pat McArdle, that most in the field are familiar with. She threw down the gauntlet and said, we need a replacement for the panel cooker because it doesn't weather well, and we have to get away from the polyethylene cooking bag because as it's been found that it's being used in areas where there's very little water, so if that cooking bag gets soiled, that's it. It's difficult to reuse or difficult to clean. She also said that we need to look at a target of about $30 to be able to produce a cooker. And what can we come up with besides the polyethylene bag? So I kind of scratched my head and took on the challenge and came up with a Fluteboard panel type cooker and began playing with insulated polycarbonate panels that are often used for greenhouse construction.
Clear.
And they're clear, and I came up with a cube that everything sort of slotted together so it could all be folded flat. And it turned out it worked reasonably well, but it was quite a learning experience for me because I realized that cube structure was reflecting away as much light as was letting in. And things have kind of evolved to the point where people have discovered that probably what works as best for a cooking enclosure itself is two Pyrex 3-quart bowls on top of each other that are round because that globe type shape allows light to be reflected directly in to the cooking pot and not be typically reflected away. I also learned that when I added a couple of little panels at the back of my cooker to make more of a curved back, I saw an increase of about 20-25 degrees in temperature. So I'm personally...
This is what Paul is talking about,
Sure.
Where he's built the enclosure into the cooker with these clear
Right.
panels.
It looked slick. I also wanted something that looked a little nicer than just sort of a bag in a panel box. However, I'm personally a big fan of Sharon Clausen's work with a Copenhagen cooker. I like the tulip shape, I like the flexibility of it, and I like the round shape. I've also sort of looked at what are the commonalities among all the different types of cookers, box cookers, panel cookers, parabolics, the advantages and disadvantages. We know that the parabolics are able to cook at very high temperatures, which is kind of good, but they need to be constantly monitored or they'll burn food because they're cooking so hot, and they need to be constantly adjusted. Well, a panel cooker is a little simpler, doesn't cook quite as hot, but as Tom mentioned, they can be set out and maybe only shifted maybe once an hour for a little bit more sun. Or ever. Yeah. So that it's a convenience thing. What can be learned from that? And so what I've learned is I think the best panel cookers out these days are ones that have more of a curved shape. Sharon Clausen's the Copenhagen cooker certainly does, and even Roger Haynes' cooker now, it has kind of gone in that direction. The trick is, again, what is being used for the cooking enclosure, and I think the double glass bowls really work well, but there's an affordability issue and a difficulty of being able to transport those. And box cookers have been around forever. They cook well, primarily because they use this insulated chamber for cooking to retain the heat. The reflectors, frankly, on the sun oven, they're somewhat primitive. They've been around forever. We played around a little bit with reflectivity. If you have reflectors that oppose each other at the same angle, you might get light that comes in, bounces over, hits the other one, and bounces away, rather than being reflected into the pot. I'm also wondering, some people have played with parabolic cookers now, if they used a deeper dish and didn't have quite such a tight focal point for the heat, if the pot was simply down lower, so it was a broader circle of heat, it might not cook quite as hot, but it also might not require as much adjustment.
True.
And so I think some of these things can be pulled together to come up with what is more of an optimal design, kind of combining the best aspects of the different varieties.
Sure. So many things I could bounce back from my experience. The SK14, which is a meter and a half almost, and it's got about maybe an 1.5 inch thing for a pot, a little grid. And I would invariably, if I had like a beef stew, the solids would char where the focal point would move. It would be this kind of smile-shaped char over the course of 15, 20 minutes. Not very big, and no big deal if you just keep stirring it. But I finally figured out with the Haynes being lifted up and it being kind of almost like a deep parabola. I mean, when the shape ends up being almost a parabola, how about if I make a grid just with 3 metal rods and add an inch or two? And I've been doing that now with beans, where I do the same thing in the Haynes cooker, and I don't get the charring, and I get just the steady, really simmer boil. I don't get the real hard boil in this corner of the pot or wherever I adjust it and it moves over here. The polycarbonate greenhouse glass, there's a woman with a blog called Frugal Green Girl, all one word, Frugal Green Girl, who did exactly that out her window in a box style. And it's just the window itself closes and is the last bit to keep the heat in. And she cooks with it, and she just sets it out with a 2x4 on outside her window is this roof over maybe the entrance to the house on the first floor or something, and very satisfied with it. It's one I actually have a PowerPoint with. Okay, cookers I want to replicate or get for my collection, and that's one. And it looks like you've pretty much done the same thing with the addition of reflectors. She doesn't have reflectors. One thing I was going to do to introduce this whole thing was to say, because I've learned a lot about solar cooking, when I go out to the average crowd, I'm like the least ignorant person in the room. But like this, where we are now, I'm the most ignorant. I can't hold a candle.
Well, you've had a lot of first-hand, hands-on cooking. Well, unfortunately, I live in this area here, where I can't solar cook at my own residence.
Your residence you can't because you have a lot of trees. You live in the forest, but I can solar cook.
Tom does.
Sure.
Well, in Minnesota, I call it the variety weather belt. It's when I do these brunches, I have to wait till Thursday to call a Saturday brunch. And Thursday, if the forecast is for, it's partly cloudy, I just won't call it because I don't want to take the chance. Like Joe Radabaugh says, you go to the rainbow festivals and it's raining. Right. I bet you can't cook now. Yeah, right.
The early parabolics were fairly shallow dishes.
Yeah.
And so you're going to have a very high focal point.
Yep.
And it seems like some of the more recent ones, they've learned to have more of a deep parabolic, have a lower focal point. And then I'm wondering if there would be some sort of flexible height adjustment so you could have the pot could be able to go up and down. You could have it high for a tight focus or be able to lower it for a little more broad focus that might require a little less maneuvering.
That's a good idea because if you imagine the sun coming from all angles of the parabola going to a single spot on the bottom of the pot, it's going to definitely burn there, but you could actually, it's going to go like this, right?
Right, so you lower it down.
In an area that has a wider area. That's a kind of a...
Sure. Well, because the best panel cookers that I'm seeing are the ones that have begun to sort of mimic a parabola, having more of a round sculpted shape rather than flat-sided panels.
If you think about a lot of panel cookers with a flat back panel, there are going to be light rays. If you take your laser pointer, that are going to bounce off next to the pot, hit the back, and bounce right back out. So whenever you're designing a cooker, take a laser pointer, stand it back a bit, and point at make sure you don't get the 45 degree. The Smithsonian Institute called me once and wanted to know how to adjust the panels on the Kyoto box cooker. I said, put them at a 45 degree. Well, what does that do? That goes boom, boom, boom. So luckily somebody told them to put it at a 60 degree. It still didn't cook. And we were in the Pentagon. I wasn't there, but Pat McArdle was in the Pentagon, in the center of the Pentagon, with this cooker, with the National Geographic Society. Anyway, they could not get food to cook in this Kyoto box, and we cooked it for them in a cookette or something else, or a hot pot. And we beseeched the magazine, National Geographic, please don't publish this cooker. I know they published it.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Like that, that George Clooney movie with that thing that looks like a megaphone.
Right. That's right.
There is a movie. I mentioned this to Julie Green because she posted something about criticizing Clooney for the movie. There's a movie called Secret Ballot, made in Iran, about a woman a poll agent going around getting ballots to people on this island. And the one scene, she goes to this remote village where they have a solar testing facility type thing, comes out and says, well, I don't have time for that. And it's because it's a woman. There's a lot of cultural things there.
Yeah.
But he says, would you like some solar tea? And he walks to this, it's the big parabolic. It looks like it's made from the insides of pop cans all around it. And there's the tea kettle steaming away, and he's pouring a steaming cup of tea. And it's like, but it's this 3-minute segment, not even 3 minutes, but very, very positive.
Yeah.
Talking about the deep and being able to adjust in a parabola, on one of those screw jack things for labs, where you can put samples in and bring it up to the flame or whatever, and lower it as you need it. And I replaced the solid metal thing with just a cooling rack grid. And I figured out you could attach the base to one part of the open circle at the bottom, and then the top to the other side. So as you raised it, the pot would be there, and it could still be kind of in the middle while it's tipping the reflector at the same time. So there are ways to do it with just duct tape and
one of the inherent problems with a box cooker that's sat on the ground is the front part of the box was blocking a lot of the sun from the front.
Yep.
And the sun oven, they addressed it by being able to tip the box and use a gimbal type platform on the inside. That's great. It just makes it a little more complicated, and why their cooker costs a little bit more. It's well made. It gets by primarily because it's so well insulated, I think, and it's nicely made.
Yeah. And one other thing I wanted to mention was about water pasteurization. Ask the average person, how do you make water safe to drink using heat? And they say, oh, you boil it for 20 minutes.
Right.
People might say you boil it, bring it to a boil. But actually, tests show that raising it to 68 degrees Celsius or 150 degrees Fahrenheit kills all the human disease-causing pathogens. So there'll be little spores from the pathogens, or like eggs, you can think of it that way, that could hatch, but when you drink it, they don't do anything to your body. So the pathogens that would hurt the human are all killed at 150 degrees. So we've, a lot of you here know that we've come up with at Solar Cookers International, with the help of other people, with a WAPI, a water pasteurization indicator, which has a little tube with wax in it. And you turn the tube so the wax is at the top, and you set it in the water. And if the wax melts and goes to the bottom of the tube, you know that it reached pasteurization temperature. So I spent years and years trying to come up with a low-tech thermometer that you could somehow just tell somebody using information on a web page, here's how you could make this thermometer. And I thought of things like wrap a newspaper around your finger and stick it in the water for, if you can stand it for 5 seconds, it's okay. I could never come up with anything. So one day it struck me, gee, there's two aspects. There's temperature and there's volume. So we can measure volume very easily, right? Because let's just say we have a glass with a certain amount of water. I came up with this idea of taking 3 measures full of water, bringing it to a boil, and as soon as it's at a full boil, pour another measure full of cold water in it, take it off the fire, and then cook or make another one. I call this the boil 3, add 1 method. And if you do the math, it comes out that the water is perfectly safe to drink because it has the boiling temperature was lowered slightly by adding the cup of cold water, but it still was above the pasteurization temperature. Now I needed to have a gigantic fudge factor in there because water boils at a lower temperature at higher elevations. And also the water that you're pouring in, you don't know if that's 1 degree Celsius water or if that's room temperature tepid water. So by doing the math of taking the 1 degree, the 33 degree Fahrenheit water, the just barely liquid, and being at 14,000 feet, I think that was the number I used. When you do that, you can do boil 3 and add 1, and it works in all cases. I'm talking about theoretically and mathematically. But it's on the website. Sure. Just type in solarcooking.org/boil. But the reason I wanted to mention that is because this is possibly a breakthrough, but it's also something that could be dangerous if it's not correct. So I'm trying to get the word out about this for people to try it. And some problems that people have come up with is that people might take that same beaker they used to pour the water in, and then after the water's safe, pour it back in that beaker and drink from it.
Right.
Where you've now, this is still contaminated with the water. So there are, I think there's mention that you pour the hot water into the beaker so there's a lot of aspects of it. But if you're in a country where you're not boiling your water because you don't have the fuel for it, and I know by working with these people in the slums in Kenya that the fuel is costing them about the same or twice as what it's costing them for the food, the charcoal that they use to cook. They're basically not boiling their water. So this is a way where they could get most of the savings of using water pasteurization, but you can't, 150 degrees, you can't measure it. A sauna,
right,
without a thermometer, because a sauna is like 104 or 5, and you know how hot that is if you get in it. Just imagine if it was 112. Okay, when you get to 150, you're going to burn yourself. It's going to feel like boiling to you. So there's no way to measure it that I know of without a thermometer. So this is a way to get the savings of pasteurization over boiling, but by using volume measurement instead of temperature measurement. And it needs to be tested in the field. It needs to be done with, by doing test strips. Some people have actually done this a little bit. I have some of the research that's been done on the page on the wiki.
There's also been a little bit of research done with little metal strips like a coat hanger that have a thermal memory property. So if you have a little rod, you can simply bend it, put it in the water, and when it reaches that temperature, the memory aspect of it, that little rod will straighten out.
Nitinol.
Sure. And it would be at the right temperature?
You can, nitinol or nitinol, I'm not sure the pronunciation, can be made at various temperatures, and I've got various samples.
Reused indefinitely.
And you could take a straight piece, just bend it, and stick it in the water. The problem is, if you stick it in the water, it's going to go to the bottom, where the heat is depending on how you're applying the heat.
Got to put it on a string or something.
So there are ways. If you're doing solar cooking with a panel cooker, that'd be fine.
Yep.
But if you're doing in a parabolic cooker or a fire, that wouldn't work so well. We've worked with that. If you type in NITINOL on the wiki, search for that, you'll see there's a bunch of research papers and stuff on that. Sure. Because that's another possibility.
Well, and the other question was simply, I mean, there's so much stuff on the wiki. It's wonderful. I don't give anyone any other websites. I mean, there's no point, because often what is on another website is already referred to on the wiki. They'll find it there. So the question is, just out of curiosity, how do you keep it stocked up with new stuff? And do you have a strategy for that, or is it just? I mean, it's probably at the stage it's in. There's so much there. It seems like, could there be anything else? Well, just like me in the tent, and all of a sudden here the umbrella shows up. There's always something else.
Do you want to mention anything about that, Paul?
Well, it's frankly, Luther, a little bit of a struggle. I mean, we work with actually somewhat limited resources. We all are part-time and putting our time into it. And there is certainly a lot of information there. And so it's the different technologies, and if somebody comes up with a new cooker, incorporating their new cooker in. But there's also then trying to stay abreast of events that are happening, current events, and topical news, what's happening in countries. And so we're spread a little thin. And so we basically are doing the best we can with the resources we have to make it as current and relevant as we can. We have about 1,800 pages on the wiki, and I wonder sometimes if that is a little bit of a hindrance for people going there to explore, and the ease of just simply explaining something on the Facebook or asking somebody just one question about something, rather than, I wonder, why don't they just go to the wiki and type in that word, and you might find an incredible amount of information about that topic.
I agree. Also, when you go to Wikipedia, you don't look down some menus to try to find your way to the article you're looking for. You go to the search box and you search. So people that, there's a lot of, we hear things from various people, I couldn't find such and such, and I kind of scratch my head and go, there's a search box.
Yes.
We have thousands of redirects. So if you type foil it'll take you to the reflective material page. You know, if you type Mylar, it'll take you to the reflective material page. We have thousands of these. So if you're having trouble, you know, finding your way there by finding a link to something, just search. And if you have any things anything about it that you think could be improved, feel free to write us. But let me mention a few other ways that we find information that we can populate the wiki with. Is whenever there's a conference, we make sure to contact the conference organizers to get the papers, and then we post the papers on the individual page for the subject of that paper. Dar Curtis, who's sort of a founder of Solar Household Energy, he spends a lot of time going through Google Alerts, I know Paul does too, where you can put in keywords and then Google will send you whenever somebody puts that word on a web page or a posting somewhere. And he keeps us supplied with a lot of news coming from around the world. We watch the Facebook pages. That's why it would be nice if there were fewer. We watch them, and if we see something that's useful for other people to know about, because you know Facebook, it rolls past you. You look at it in the morning, and then you say, I want to show it to somebody. You can't find it. You can search. People, they make it kind of hard to find the search box. You can search. But then later somebody will reply to it and say, yep, and then it'll go up to the top again. So it's not a really good database.
No.
So we watch that, and we post a lot of links to the wiki into it. That's another way we find out the information. We also try to monitor various organizations' websites and the newsletters and things that they publish. So make sure if you have a newsletter that the best address would be webmaster@solarcooking.org to send things to. And like you were saying before, it's trying to be the place where everything known about solar cooking is archived. So if you have a new design, if you have a paper that you've written, if you have whatever it is, send it to webmaster@solarcooking.org. And if you don't want to put it up yourself, people seem to have a little bit of an aversion to doing that. We'll be happy to put it up for you.
Sure.
And you look at water pasteurization page, you'll find dozens and dozens of papers in there about any subject. Basically, you'll see scientific research papers, various things that people have just written. You'll find amazing amounts of information.
A Herculean effort to keep that wiki going. It's got to be. I mean, there's just literally, I'll go through and I'm thinking that was posted, 3-4 years ago, and I thought I had gone through the whole thing, but I don't even remember seeing it. Maybe it's my memory, or maybe it's just it's just so much stuff. So it's just amazing. No, I can't think of any other questions. I'm sure I'll have some after I'm on the road. But anything else you want to pass on to the rest of the community?
Covered a lot.
I think there's one extra thing. Heat retention cooking doesn't get enough play, I think. Going to a village somewhere and bringing out solar cookers is a large change in your cooking. Heat retention cooking, where you could cook the food for a certain amount, heat the food to boiling for a certain amount of time. We have charts on the wiki that tell you how much time, and then put it in an insulated box, just pillows or blankets or whatever, and letting it continue to cook like that is a much simpler thing, I would imagine, to introduce to people. And because if you realize what's the ultimate goal is to save firewood, reduce the amount of smoke. Those are probably the biggest goals we have. That solves some of those goals. Also, thermoses help solve that goal also. Right. Another thing that's been working with recently is sprouting. The refugees in the slums in Kenya, basically, we've been providing money for them every 2 weeks to buy food because they're locked down from COVID. And they send pictures back of what they buy. And so we see it'll be like 4 kilos of cornmeal, and maybe 1 of flour and 1 of sugar, and then some cooking oil. And it turns out they don't eat beans anymore, or because they can't afford to cook the beans. And these people haven't yet been introduced to solar cooking. They will soon. But we saw one person though bought mung beans, and I realized when I asked our contact over there why were they buying mung beans, because they're smaller and they cook faster. And I said, well, how about sprouting them? And so we've now got a sprouting club going, and there's ways. If you just go on our website to the wiki and just type sprouting, you'll see there's ways to make the big, thick, nice mung bean sprouts like you have in a Chinese restaurant, not little sprouts like you get from a jar. And
So these people now, about half of the families in the group we're working with are now buying mung beans and sprouting them and eating the fresh. Like, for example, the vitamin C content goes up about 8,000% from a dry bean to the sprouted bean. If you take the water out of it, what I mean is, that's how I did the math is. And so things like this, like I'm more right now going towards the goal, like two goals I mentioned, saving firewood and charcoal and those kind of things, and also reducing smoke. These are some other things that you can do that work, and some of them are sometimes might be easier to promote in the beginning than solar cooking. But we also think the amount of trust we have now with this group will allow us to then go the next step to solar cooking, and there'll be more of an ability to work with us and get some long-term use of solar cooking going there too.
Sure. Okay.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you.